Okay, this is going to be XPhys Lab 3 exercise testing. So there's a variety of different assignments you have to do to measure heart rate and RPE during your own exercise programs. Today I'll sort of be running you through the different steps we take to run an exercise test that measures cardiac output. So cardiac output being the combination of heart rate and stroke volume to get a total picture of the hemodynamics. And we'll talk about the measurement system we use to measure that and the different sort of parameters we would use to measure all throughout the test. I'll just situate myself off to the side here and we'll get going. Okay, so everything that combines into cardiac output, being heart rate and stroke volume, is mediated by a variety of factors. I'll just switch to actually the laser here. So it has a couple of scenarios over here on the left side, sort of crisis, high blood pressure. We're obviously mainly focused on exercise, but it includes these because these external sort of triggers or internal situations can also trigger a very similar situation. Your conductile tissue of the heart does not necessarily know if you are scared or if you have started exercising. It just knows that the body has had a stressor placed on it and that it needs to increase heart rate to increase blood to the limbs to allow them to continue to function. So you can see that here, activation of skeletal muscle demands more blood, and then so they also, as more blood comes to it, it will increase that venous pumping more blood up from the legs, and the valves will help with that in the lower legs especially. Taking more blood back to the heart and more venous return is affecting our stroke volume here. So increased venous return, more blood coming into the heart means more blood that can be pumped out. Also, increased contractile force of the cardiac muscle is due to increased sympathetic response, so increases in systems like adrenaline and other hormones that would increase the actual contractile properties of the heart tissue and muscle itself, so affecting the actual nerves that drive that tissue, but also affecting the sinus rhythm and the actual rate, so the heart rate in terms of beats per minute, in terms of how fast the atria and ventricles contract. So all those go into changing your cardiac output. And you can see it doesn't have the arrows here, but obviously some of this would then feed back in, because with increased cardiac output, you have more blood going out, and then generally that would lead to increased venous return. So we'll plot some data and we'll look at our Physioflow data and how that maps out after. I just wanted to include this. This is a slightly different diagram of the exact same thing, just broken down a little bit nicer than the last figure in terms of the actual factors affecting both stroke volume and heart rate and how those are actually separated. So this breaks it down into preload, contractility, and afterload, all summating into end diastolic volume and end systolic volume, contributing to your stroke volume and your heart rate. So typically what we'll see, and we'll see in this test, is that you actually have your heart rate to start increasing first. Your actual sinus rhythm is the first thing to start increasing, to actually increase that cardiac output. And you can see, because it's a multiplicative equation, you can actually have an increase in one, increasing the total cardiac output while the other stays the same. And then what we'll see is, as venous return increases, we start to see stroke volume pick up for the majority of the increasing cardiac output towards the end stages of exercise. So the first thing I wanted to go over is Borgs' rating of perceived exertion scale here. It's rated on a scale of 6 to 20. And if you haven't had this described to you in lecture, this is very typical on what we use to gauge the participant's exertion level during an exercise test. So we typically have orient them to the scale, make sure you show it to them before you start the test, making sure that they know that 6 is resting or no exercise, and then 20 is maximal exertion. Each of these, if you multiply them by 10, roughly correspond to the heart rate that is associated with each of these levels of exertion for a somewhat healthy 20-year-old participant, for example. Obviously, your max heart rate comes down as you age, so that 20 will not always correspond. Another thing you'll see, especially in this test, because I didn't do it quite right, is that the maximal exertion does not always directly line up with heart rate, especially in things where the person is not practiced and are very muscular demanding, particularly cycling, if the person is not practiced at cycling. So we need to show them this because we'll take their RPE at the end of every stage to know when they're getting close or if we've increased the levels too quickly. So we'll need to know when to push them, and we get them to rank this at the end of every stage. The other thing you're going to need before you start your test is going to be a chart like this. So you can see I've sort of pre-filled this out, and this is typically what I would do before running an exercise test. I pick my protocol and I know roughly what I want to do with the participant. I have our warm-up and then a list of our stages and cool down. I might not even have these minutes necessarily filled out because I don't know if they're going to get to these end stages, but I have a target RPM and a target wattage for them. Now, typically, I choose the protocol based on the person's familiarity with cycling. Let's say in this case, it was a cycling test. Not all that familiar with cycling, but a fairly fit individual. So I chose a low RPMs. Higher cadences typically lend themselves to more experienced cyclists. They want to keep that cadence up, and it would just feel really weird for them to be going 70. And if any of you have done the YMCA cycle ergometer test, you'll know that 50 feels very, very slow. If you have too much experience with spin classes or riding your bike, you will be very, very annoyed with that test. I typically have a 2-minute warm-up at something around 50 watts just to make sure the participant is comfortable but not tire them out. And typically you could see overall better endurance performance if you warm the person up a little bit better. But again, we want to capture the entire response of the heart right from that initial ramp up of heart rate in this test. So particularly in this test, I'm not interested in how much wattage the person can put out. I'm interested in getting them to that 20 at a 20 max, getting them to a max heart rate and max cardiac output, and capturing it right from start to finish. So I started at a very sort of slow warm up. Then jumping to 140 watts, increasing by 40 watts every 2 minutes until we then hit the max. Again, this is not necessarily a max. This would keep going if we needed more stages. That's just the way I typed in the computer. And we would have a cool down then after, again, back down to 50 watts, not taking the resistance completely off. Things that we're going to measure throughout the test that aren't being measured by our cardiac output system are heart rate. We're going to take that radially, I believe, in this test. Or no, I actually used a heart rate monitor in this test. So we're taking heart rate, RPE, and blood pressure. Heart rate's really obviously easy to capture if you're using a heart rate monitor, and I would definitely recommend having it. If you start getting weird readings, you can then obviously revert to radial palpation as a backup, but we do rely on a heart rate monitor, especially when you're doing more complex monitoring and you're watching the numbers like I was on the Physioflow, and then you can have an assistant doing blood pressure because that's definitely more involved. Taking RP at the end of every stage. All these measures are taken at the end of every stage, I should say. Okay, so this is a picture of our Physioflow Enduro. So for somebody looking at this, you would think that this kind of looks like an ECG. A 12-lead ECG, you'll know, has 10 actual stickies that go on it. This actually only has 6, and part of them, a few of them, act like a regular 2-lead or 3-lead ECG, basically measuring the cardiac rhythm and taking heart rate out of that and taking when the heart is beating. Then the rest of them actually work to use this impedance cardiography. So these sensors actually project or transmit this electrical signal into the body at a very low frequency. Then when that low frequency is altered by either the heart beating or blood flow through specific areas, and you'll see that especially in this picture, the person has two electrode placements on their carotid here, then that electrical field gets distorted, and through a very complex set of equations and calibrations, the system knows exactly what that corresponds to in the amount of blood flow, and then can revert that back to the person's height and weight, which are very important. You'll see I put in this test resting blood pressure, because the actual pressure of the blood moving through will determine how much actual volume there is. So it infers how much volume there is and gives you a stroke volume output. Stroke volume and then times heart rate is your total cardiac output. So that's how that does that. I'm going to duck off here for a second and I'll commentate over this a little bit, but I'm just going to play this video of us running the test, and yeah, I'll talk over it just a little bit here. I think I can get out of my pointer there. Yeah. Okay, so I'll let that play. Actually, I'll stay on just for the setup here. You can see I'm setting up the heart rate monitor. So he has the heart rate monitor strap on. I'm setting up the watch, just making sure that the watch is on the bike before. You can see that we have our blood pressure cuff set up there and ready to go. And then we also have our Physioflow in this little pocket here. And you can see the electrode leads dangling there. So I'm going to jump ahead here, and I clipped this out. It's just a small little window in the program, so I kind of zoomed in on it, but we put in the participant's details, and you can see you're talking to the participant throughout this, making sure that you have all the correct information. You can write this down before, especially if you're in a situation like a professional situation and it's not a one-on-one situation in the lab. You would have the person's chart or some type of background information on the person. You can straight fill it out from there. This is important. Like I said, some tests like a VO2 will only need weight. They won't need the person's height. It's important to calibrate this and get all the parameters, because it all factors into how much actual blood the person has in their body and changes the assumptions of the algorithms which run underneath the Physioflow impedance cardiography technology. So here is the little diagram. It actually pops up on screen, tells you where to put your electrodes. Right here I grab, I believe this is our new prep. This is just like an abrasive gel. So what this does is this just reduces the input impedance of the skin, making it easier to conduct from the sort of wet gel electrodes into the skin. So I abrade each area that is listed here. So here I'm doing the under axillary in the orange, and then the 2 on the back. And as I just do that, I'm rubbing it in. It's kind of like a toothpaste where it's a little gritty. So like I said, it kind of takes off some of those dead skin cells. Just waiting a second, I'll then grab a bunch of alcohol swabs. I typically like using isopropyl alcohol swabs because they're really good at cutting through some oils on the skin and helping wipe away some of that sort of grittiness. It's almost like a liquid sandpaper form. So it's kind of uncomfortable if you go pretty hard on the person. With some of the newer EMG and ECG systems, there's not a huge need to really prep the participant. But here, the Physioflow Enduro actually takes these very specialized large wet gel electrodes. I typically don't burn them unless we are doing a full-on test on a client or someone who's coming into the lab. They are about 5 times as expensive as our regular electrodes. Here I'm using our regular disposable 3 centimeter regular non-wet gel electrodes. So I did want to abrade the skin and make it quite well prepped. So you can see that once that's dry, I'm going to apply a little bit of conductive gel on here. Again, because I'm not using the wet gel electrodes, I just want really good signal. So I'll skip ahead here, but essentially I'll do that red marker first. I'll do the white and blue on the neck, the orange under the arm, and then the black and green on his back. So there we go. Skipping ahead, those are done. Now those correspond nicely. They do it on the system here to the color-coded electrode leads, which are then placed on the participant. They snap onto the electrodes. They kind of bite onto the person, and you'll see that I'll snap those on. So you can kind of push them onto the participant, and then I'll tape them over just to make sure that it doesn't fall off during the test. The one thing that I typically forget and isn't super comfortable for the participant is, again, those side electrodes. One of them is over their SCM, their sternocleidomastoid, but one of them is over a sort of semi-soft tissue up under the neck by the carotid. Pressing that onto the participant isn't always the most comfortable, but once you've already had the area prepped, it's very hard to go back. So this is something that you can see isn't always super comfortable for the participant. If that's the case where you are sort of pressing it on, it's just pushing into their skin and they don't love it, you can take that electrode off, put the electrode on, like take the lead off, put the electrode on, and then actually stick the whole thing back on them. Or what you can do, like I was doing here, is sort of, if they have loose enough skin, you can pinch your finger up under it, using that as a backstop without pulling too much on the small little muscles and tendons that are in the neck, and then using your finger as a backstop. Again, taping over all that and making sure that it's prepped. Then handing him the Physioflow to put on as a belt, and then the participant can put their shirt back on actually. So once I tape the back ones up, I'll pop off here actually and go full screen. Okay, we'll continue that video, and I believe, yeah, so we get the participant up. Sort of show you quickly, but you already sort of know what that looks like. They can pop their shirt back on here if you'd like, but it does get a little bit cumbersome, and I sort of, if they're comfortable, like to see that the electrodes aren't falling off, especially if we have high impedances. We had semi-high impedance on one of them, but what it did show was that this participant had a fairly high resting heart rate. That's typically totally fine. People aren't always the most comfortable with the test, and if they know they have a high resting heart rate, it's not necessarily something to take issue with. So here you can see me setting the bike, setting the wattage to the 50 watt warm-up, and we're going to start the warm-up. And once I've inputted all of his data, it runs through 30 cycles of calibration, which we cut out here and didn't show, but it's essentially just calibrates for 30 heartbeats while he's on the bike at rest, and then we have him on, and you'll see that these averages change through the test. This on the left here is the Bluetooth signal quality, and this here is the impedance cardiography, while here is his sinus rhythm from the regular electrocardiogram. So these will shift along and sort of crunch down as they normalize. So the X scale will get smaller and smaller, and so the person is or the participant is going to run through his warm-up here, which isn't all that exciting. We can fast forward through that until we get some actual data, because we're not going to change anything here. We're talking to him, make sure it feels comfortable, he feels good, there's no pinching in his legs, the pedals feel good, he looks fairly comfortable here. We're making sure that we're ready to go for everything we need to on the test, because once it gets harder, it gets a lot harder to reach down and change the pedal and change any of those things. Nick here is acting as the blood pressure monitor, and the, actually, I was doing blood pressure. He's doing radial palpation just to make sure the heart rate is correct. He's also keeping track of time and RPE. Okay, so you can see that at the end of the warm-up stage here, we both take our measurements, try and do it fairly quickly, as the participant has to have both arms sort of stabilized, and that's not the most comfortable position to bike in. But once he's good, we say, okay, you can grab the handles back again. Just sort of let our blood pressure dangle there. Yep. And then moving on, I then increase the resistance like we saw on our sheet. So we're going up to 140 watts now. You can see that the resistance is getting harder almost immediately. You can see that him start working a little bit, and if you listen, you can hear a lot more resistance on the bike. It uses a flywheel with a friction belt on it, so the harder he pedals and the more resistance is on it, the more you can hear it. Okay, so if we look at our graphs here, we can see that our heart rate started fairly high, around 130, but we can already see it's increasing. It's up to 171, and we're sort of halfway through our first stage here at 140 watts. So we're going to keep moving on and keep an eye definitely on this, on this data up in the top. At the end of our first workload stage here now, our second overall stage, but our first workload stage, Nick and I are going to take our measurements, our heart rate, RPE, and blood pressure. We can see that our heart rate's up to 172, and cardiac output is rising almost identically to this heart rate graph. No real change in stroke volume yet. As we fast forward in the test a little bit, so now we're up to 180 watts because I would have increased it into the second workload stage. You can see that Justin is really starting to work. 180 watts is definitely not a light workload. I chose this because he's fairly fit, and although he doesn't cycle, I wanted the test to be fairly quick. I didn't want to keep you guys watching a multi-stage test. I wanted to really show the distinction between heart rate ramping up fairly fast at the onset of exercise, and then stroke volume really taking over as the exercise gets very, very tough towards the end. Okay, so Justin's going to be cycling at, you can see the signal's getting a little messy here, actually, as he starts moving. It's fairly good at detecting that, but we have to watch the signals constantly. If you start getting really, really messy signals like that and it doesn't return back to a semi-normal looking baseline, you can get wonky measurements. But Justin's cycling here at 180 watts. We're getting towards the end of that second stage. We're going to take our measurements, and again, this is where it gets really tough at the end of each stage to get the participant to sort of comply with your measures. You can see his head down, he's really trying to grind those legs. Trying to take our measurements. It's hard to take blood pressure like this too, especially when the person's really rocking and they really want to get those RPMs back up to 70. Keep in mind he has to maintain 70 RPMs the whole time. This is a digitally braked bike, meaning it will adjust the wattage based on his RPMs. So if he slows down, the amount of actual physical resistance on the wheel goes higher, so it equates to the same amount of work per revolution. But it actually is kind of slow to adjust, so I still am encouraging him to stay at 70 RPMs. If you have a really, really high quality digitally braked bike person, you can give them a general range, but they'll go at whatever you need them to be. I actually talked over that, but we're going to make sure right here we see that he's really got head down. We're encouraging him, but just into the third stage here, so going up to 220 watts, it's just getting too much to manage, and that's really coming from a background of not cycling. Again, I didn't choose a super easy test. I didn't want to go long. I didn't quite think that it would be that quick, or I probably would have tried to slow the progression of the stages down probably to about 30 watts per stage. This is a little bit quicker than I thought, again, because we're not into the 8 to 12 minute range. That's typical for a VO2 test, but I wanted to get a little bit longer response in terms of looking at what stroke volume could do to cardiac output. It didn't necessarily work out for me at this test, and I said, you know what, let's just leave it in, because that really goes to show you that it does take time and knowing your participant and really knowing exactly how to design that protocol to get exactly what you want out of a test. And even being off by a minute can sort of not give me exactly the demo that I wanted. It's pretty close. We definitely see that we have a steady increase in heart rate that corresponds to the original ramp, and then as we see stroke volume really start to ramp up, that multiplying effect on cardiac output, you really start to see cardiac output ramp way up. But unfortunately his legs just couldn't necessarily grasp that wattage because he's not used to cycling a ton. And you'll see that very often on cycle tests, a lot less on treadmill tests. The person will tire out sort of their whole, it's like a whole body tired, but on cycling, really when the person with pulmonary, like breathing wise feels okay, whole body RPE feels okay, their legs are a 25 out of 20, I have to stop. And they almost are frustrated as well because they're just going, it's my legs. And then after the fact, they know that they probably could have gone longer, but that's just the fact that they're not cycling, and you get up to those high wattages very quickly, really burns the person out. So from that, I think we can stop. We're just running him through a cool down now and taking baseline measurements just to make sure that he's coming back down. So I'll come back here. So looking at our sheet filled out, this is what our filled out sheet looks like. And again, you're not necessarily always going to use the whole thing, but we had our end of warm up, heart rate, RPE. That's a pretty good RPE for end of warm up. Heart rate, that's definitely high, but he knew he had a high starting heart rate. And blood pressure just into exercise, a little high, but nothing too crazy. Again, only got into the third stage, so we recorded at end of second stage, and then we were able to record heart rate at the end, and RP is obviously a 20 if it's a volitional termination of the test, but you don't necessarily get to do your blood pressure measurement when that happens because a person has already been done exercise for 30 seconds by the time you get the measurement in. So those are our measures we take during the test. This is a representation of that, or a graphing of that data we were talking about. And again, you can see everything displayed here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put 3 data sets of different data into the Google Drive folder that is going to be linked in the description here. That is going to be that for this video. Thanks so much for watching, and hope you guys enjoyed it.